Good afternoon, Alan Skinner here, week 6 video discussion. Arguably one of the recent major events in world history was the First World War, which began in August of 1914. The war spread to engulf most of Europe, along with colonial possessions in the Middle East, Africa, and Pacific. By the time the armistice was officially signed on 11 November 1918, some 40 million people had perished, and much of Europe lay in ruins. You have the collapse of several imperial houses, the rise of Bolshevism, and both Great Britain and Republican France are gravely weakened as a result. And you also have the rise of the United States of America as a world power. So negotiating a lasting peace from the armistice really was beyond the abilities of the statesmen of the day, and really the peace treaty of Versailles only paves the way for the rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s. Now, scoping such a major event is exceedingly difficult, especially for an American history class that we're discussing. So what I wanted to do is highlight the legacy of the war through the lens of just the armistice, that negotiated ceasefire that ended the fighting. So depending on one's viewpoint and experiences, that first armistice could have brought joy or anguish, or a very complex mix of emotions and attitudes. So I selected several newspaper articles to convey to students a sense of those conflicting emotions and attitudes, both national and on a personal level. So I would require students to select two of those articles, one from the American perspective, and then analyze and write a critical essay exploring themes and attitudes. First, what was the general theme of the American article? Secondly, what are the attitudes and opinions of the people represented in the article? Thirdly, how do the American attitudes compare to the Europeans? And lastly, what conclusions can we derive? So I definitely want them to do a little bit of work there. So what I want to do is talk very briefly about the articles, and then we'll wrap up with a short conclusion. So when the armistice took effect at 11 a.m., a wave of celebration swept New York City, as was described by eyewitnesses interviewed in 1968 by Michael Kaufman. New Yorkers danced in the streets and burnt effigies of Kaiser Wilhelm in the gutters, and foghorns and steam whistles shrieked in victory. But not all people celebrated, as widows and mothers signifying the combat death of a loved one with a gold star. The night was marked by drunken riots, and the next day a parade of socialists on Broadway was assaulted by soldiers angry over the display of the red flag of Bolshevism. Underscoring the cost of victory were the obituaries of several New York soldiers. Lieutenant Benjamin Scheider of Brooklyn and Sergeant Charles Abel of the Bronx died in the final hours of the war. But not all was bad news, as Corporal John Lee of the Bronx, who had been reported missing since September, had been discovered in a French hospital recovering from a serious wound. Julian Grande's 8 November dispatch from Vienna is tinged with hyperbole, as he describes secondhand accounts of the collapse of the Habsburg army in late October. He uncritically recounts frontline stories, machine gunning of soldiers, deserters by loyalists, and doctors abandoning their wounded to the Italians. However, his descriptions of revolutionary chaos in Vienna ring true, with accounts of angry mobs looting the city and assaulting soldiers still bearing the colors of the old regime. Berlin was perhaps in worse shape, as described in an unattributed dispatch to the New York Times, with the Kaiser forced to flee into Holland and the formation of a Bolshevik-tinged German People's Government. This attempt to take over was contested in the streets, and there was fighting between the regime and the Bolsheviks with artillery and machine guns. Now, in Paris, though, the reaction of the French to French Premier Georges Clemenceau's official announcement of the armistice, quote, he had hardly begun when the crowd of the chamber heard the muffled booming of guns, and all knew that France was rejoicing. There was the moment no left, right, or center. France is represented in that chamber was united in their hour of triumph. Yet the high cost of victory was poignantly highlighted with the celebrations in the streets. Quote, there was not one parade, there were 1,000 parades and all the great boulevards and little streets. One-legged men had the flags of the Allies tied to the crutches by the young shopwomen. Men and women wept as well as laughed, not with hysterical excitement, but honest emotion. The tragedy of this boulevard picture was a soldier who had lost his face in a battle and had been discharged from the hospital. God only knows whether he was laughing or crying. Nobody will ever know. But he was waving a flag, and for the moment he at least had forgot the hideousness to which he was doomed. End quote. As is evident from these highlighted articles, attaching meaning to the war defied, and even continues to this day, to defy a simple explanation. Nationally, Americans could reflect on their part in rescuing civilization from the clutches of militarism while fearing the rise of Bolshevism. Yet individual feelings, as we noted, could range from grief at personal loss, anger at the profits of capitalists while men were sent to fight in France, and perhaps the fear of political and economic instability. Finally, traditional roles of men and women have been upended because of the war, and a generation of men have become hardened to death and violence. Hopefully reading an analysis of the selected newspaper articles will help students frame some good analysis of their own and come up with some good essays probing the impact and the meaning of the armistice all the way from 1918 to present. Thank you, and this concludes my presentation.